Early summer, 1942. In a quiet factory line in the American Midwest, a $2 pistol is built on purpose to be crude and disposable because its real job is not to win firefights, but to poison Nazi officer confidence across occupied Europe. A $2 American pistol is the FP-45 Liberator, a single-shot stamped gun that trades accuracy and comfort for mass production and the ability to turn one close-range ambush into a captured rifle. A Nazi officer is an occupation manager who depends on routine, checkpoints, and the belief that civilians are unarmed. Fear is the currency he spends to make trains run and quotas move and people obey. It looks like a joke, but it guarantees a serious problem. If any doorway can hide a gun, then every doorway becomes a threat, and that forces an occupation army to spend more men on security than on strategy. Here's what most people believe. The Liberator was a gimmick. It was inaccurate. It was barely a weapon. Now let's test that with the constraints and the numbers. The popular story is easy to repeat. A cheap pistol gets made, it gets dropped. Few people use it. The war is decided by tanks and bombers, so the little gun is irrelevant. But the simple story collapses when you follow the constraints. Before we continue, make a prediction. Did the Liberator fail because it could not kill enough men, or did it succeed because it changed how Nazi officers had to behave? Start with what the Liberator actually is, not the myth version, the industrial version. A Liberator pistol is a single-shot, .45 caliber weapon made from stamped steel that is designed to be produced fast and handed to untrained civilians so they can kill one enemy at arm's length and take his real weapon. A .45 cartridge is a heavy pistol round that trades recoil and short range for blunt close-range stopping power, and it depends on brass and powder and factory lines. The Liberator is not trying to be a better sidearm than a German pistol. It is trying to be a better problem than a German officer can solve. That is the first constraint. Because the United States has to arm resistance movements across a continent without sending full armies to each village, they are forced to think in logistics and sabotage. They didn't have the option to place a platoon on every railway switch in France or every bridge in the Balkans. This looks like a moral appeal to courage. But it is a constraint. If you cannot be everywhere, you must create weapons that turn one person into a local shock. Now the second constraint, because resistance fighters cannot train like soldiers and cannot carry obvious weapons without being searched and shot, they are forced to prefer concealment and surprise. They didn't have the option to walk around with rifles and ammunition belts. A weapon that looks bad in a firing range can be perfect in a hallway. Now, the third constraint, because occupation control depends on officer confidence and routine compliance, the occupier is forced to treat fear as an asset. He needs civilians to believe they are helpless. He needs patrols to believe streets are safe. He needs clerks to believe their paperwork will be obeyed. The moment civilians might be armed, the entire system starts paying a tax, and that tax is where the Liberator lives. Now the first number weapon. Anchor. In 1942, the Liberator program produces about 1 million pistols in a matter of months. Compare. A standard service pistol takes more machining time and costs far more per unit. Convert. 1 million means you concede risk across a continent instead of arming a single elite unit. Punch. A million threats does not need to fire a million shots to change behavior. This is the part people miss. You do not have to distribute every pistol. You only have to make every officer believe you might have. The Liberator is a rumor you can manufacture. Now the second number weapon. Anchor, the unit cost is roughly $2 and the design is intentionally simple. Compare. A normal combat sidearm represents real investment and care and a supply chain built to preserve it. Convert. $2 means you can afford to lose it. You can drop it, hide it, bury it, hand it to a stranger. Punch. Cheap is a feature when the mission is uncertainty. That is a systems insight. Expensive weapons are optimized for performance. Cheap weapons are optimized for distribution and deniability. Now the third number weapon, Anchor. The Liberator is a single-shot weapon meant for extremely close range. Compare. Officers picture gunfights at street distance or across fields. Convert. At 10 feet, the fight is not marksmanship, it is timing and surprise. Punch. The closer the range, the less training matters and the more fear matters. A single shot sounds weak, but the goal is not sustained fire. The goal is a first kill that produces a second weapon. If a partisan kills one man and takes his rifle, then the $2 pistol has just converted itself into a German rifle and a German ammunition pouch and a German uniform. That conversion is the true design. Now widen the lens to the occupation officer problem. A Nazi officer is not just a soldier. He is a manager of coercion. He runs patrol schedules. He runs arrests. He runs requisitions. He runs labor roundups. His power depends on predictable movement. Predictable movement depends on the belief that streets are controllable. The liberator attacks that belief. Here's the paradox. The gun itself is crude, but it forces the occupier to behave as if every civilian is a trained assassin. Once that happens, the next problem is manpower. If an officer believes he can be shot at the doorway, then he demands more guards. More guards means fewer men on the rail line. Fewer men on the rail line means more sabotage succeeds. More sabotage means the occupier demands harsher reprisals. Harsher reprisals create more hatred. More hatred creates more recruits for resistance. That is the domino effect. It is not a tactical gun story. It is a system story. Now, myth busts the first popular misunderstanding. Myth: the liberator was useless because it was inaccurate and because most were never fired. Why it spread? Because the weapon looks laughable next to a service pistol and because people count success only by confirmed kills. Also, because post-war stories prefer hero weapons and dramatic battles. A stamped single-shot pistol is not romantic. Replace it with a stronger model. The Liberator is a psychological logistics tool. It is designed to raise the occupation security cost per mile of road and per office door. The evidence for this kind of success is not a kill tally. It is the pattern in occupation directives. More searches, more curfews, more escort requirements, more restrictions on movement, more time wasted. Those show up in unit diaries and police logs and after-action reports, not in medals. Now put the weapon inside the real pipeline. These pistols are meant to be dropped or smuggled through clandestine networks. That means the bottleneck is not manufacturing. It is distribution and trust. Because underground networks are vulnerable to infiltration, they are forced to minimize complexity. They didn't have the option to deliver delicate weapons that require spare parts and trained armorers. A simple pistol with a small instruction sheet can cross hands faster. Because occupied Europe is saturated with informants and checkpoints, resistance movements are forced to keep weapons small. A rifle gets you stopped. A pistol can be hidden. Because ammunition is the real limiting resource for irregular fighters, they are forced to value any weapon that uses common cartridges or that can be paired with captured stocks. And this leads to the next number weapon, Anchor. The Liberator fires a .45 cartridge which is widely produced by American industry. Compare. A specialized round would create scarcity and prevent the pistol from being used even once. Convert. If the pistol comes with only a handful of cartridges, then each cartridge becomes a decision with consequence. Punch. When you only need one shot, a handful is enough. Now the next hard truth. The Liberator does not need to be everywhere. It needs to be nowhere and everywhere at the same time. That is how fear works in an occupation. A single ambush in one town can change patrol behavior in 10 towns if the story travels. And stories travel faster than crates. So the question becomes, why did Nazi officers get spooked? Not because they thought the resistance had better guns than the Wehrmacht. They got spooked because the Liberator implied the resistance might not need better guns, they might only need one moment, one doorway, one stairwell, one office corridor, one nighttime knock. To understand this, you have to look at the occupation as a machine. Occupation is a supply chain of obedience. You pull food and coal and labor out of a population and you ship it to where you need it. You do that with paperwork and fear and routine. A $2 pistol does not defeat an army. It breaks routine. Now the fifth number weapon, Anchor. The German war economy depends on rail and road movement to feed armies and move coal and ammunition. Compare. A frontline division can fight without comfort, but it cannot fight without fuel and shells. Convert. When security demands add guards and checkpoints and escorts, then every train and convoy slows down. Punch. Slow logistics is defeat measured in days. This is why officers care. They live inside that flow. If the flow becomes risky, they become the pressure point. Now you can see the larger American logic. The United States is building bombers and tanks, but it also understands that the war is won by throughput. Throughput is not just factories. It is the enemy's ability to safely move goods. So a cheap pistol is an attempt to tax the enemy's throughput. Not by destroying bridges directly, by forcing men to guard every bridge as if it will be destroyed. Now, myth busts the second misunderstanding. Myth. Resistance warfare is mostly about heroics and daring raids. Why it spread, memoir bias, and Hollywood. We remember the explosions and forget the weeks of fear. Replace it with the stronger model. Resistance warfare is a contest over administration. The occupier tries to make compliance routine. The resistance tries to make compliance dangerous. The liberator fits that model perfectly because it turns ordinary spaces into uncertain spaces. Now escalate with consequences. Once a few officers believe civilians can be armed, they begin to change daily policy. They demand escorts for travel. They demand tighter curfews. They demand harsher searches. They demand more informants. That forces more innocent civilians into confrontation. That triggers more hatred. That expands the resistance recruiting pool. At that point, the timeline collapses into a feedback loop. The occupier is spending more energy on controlling people than on fighting the enemy army. And that is exactly what the Allies want. Now bring it back to the reality of the pistol's limitations. Do not romanticize it. The liberator is uncomfortable. It is unreliable. It is inaccurate. Now, it is meant to be used up close and then thrown away or replaced by a captured weapon. That means it does not create a guerrilla army by itself. It creates moments, and moments are how systems crack. Now, the sixth number weapon. Anchor. A single close-range kill can convert into a captured submachine gun or rifle plus magazines and identification papers. Compare. Delivering a full rifle to a partisan through airdrops risks interception and requires greater trust in handling. Convert. One pistol shot can unlock an entire enemy kit in seconds. Punch. The cheapest weapon is the one that steals the enemy's best weapon. This is not a fair fight story. It is an incentive story. German officers are trained to fear ambush, but they are also trained to believe they can reduce risk by controlling weapons. A $2 pistol says you cannot fully control weapons, and that forces a change in posture. Officers who fear surprise become less willing to move alone. Less movement slows decisions. Slow decisions create gaps. Gaps create sabotage opportunities. Now connect this to geography because Europe is not one uniform theater. In France and Belgium, the occupier is trying to control dense towns and rail nodes. In the Balkans, the occupier is facing rugged terrain where small groups can vanish. In Italy, after 1943, the front and the occupation blend into each other. In all these places, the same logic holds. When the occupier cannot trust the civilian environment, he must either flood it with troops or retreat into fortified points. Flooding costs manpower. Retreating concedes control. Either way, the gun is doing work. Now address the uncomfortable moral edge. Weapons dropped into occupied societies are not clean tools. They can be stolen, misused, trigger reprisals, create cycles of violence. That is why the liberator is so telling. It is a strategic admission that the war has become total. The line between front and rear is gone, and when that line is gone, officers are spooked because they are living in the rear that is no longer rear. Now the seventh number weapon. Anchor. The liberator is designed to be assembled and packaged in a way that supports mass shipment. Compare. Precision arms require careful handling and maintenance. Convert. When you can ship weapons in bulk, you can cede uncertainty without dedicating elite resources. Punch. Mass distribution turns fear into a commodity. Now bring in the viewer commitment again with a sharper choice. If you were a German occupation officer, would you rather face a resistance cell armed with a few rifles you can search for, or face a city where any clerk might have a disposable pistol in a drawer? One is a visible threat, the other is an invisible tax. and occupiers hate invisible taxes because they cannot be solved by one raid. Now let the dominoes finish falling. Once fear spreads, officers push policy toward harsher control. Once control gets harsher, civilian cooperation drops. Once cooperation drops, intelligence quality collapses. Once intelligence collapses, the occupier reacts with broader sweeps. Broader sweeps create more enemies. More enemies create more attacks. The gun does not have to fire often to be part of that chain. Now conclude with inevitability and cost. Was the Liberator a miracle weapon? No. Was it stupid? Maybe in pure engineering terms, could it have been avoided? Here's the hard part. If you are fighting across oceans and you need to strain an occupation system, you look for cheap tools that can be shipped and hidden and that force the enemy to waste manpower. In the end, uncertainty beat firepower. In the end, a $2 pistol beat an officer's confidence. So here's the sharp question tied to the opening. If you can force an enemy to guard every doorway, then have you changed the war without winning a single big battle? If you want real history, not myths, subscribe.